In the realm of the supernatural, there exists a class of places that seem to collect tragedy and horror like dust on their time-worn floors. Mansions. These grand structures, with their myriad rooms and echoing halls, have witnessed countless stories of death and despair. Within their ancient walls, the unfortunate guests often discover too late that they are not alone, and their stay may come at the ultimate cost. Tonight, we unravel two chilling tales of those who dared to enter these accursed estates. First, we follow a man summoned to the sprawling mansion of his dying uncle. What begins as a family visit swiftly descends into a sinister plot woven by the house's dark history. In the second tale, another unsuspecting guest visits a friend's family, only to become embroiled in a terrifying conflict within their decaying mansion. These souls, like so many before them, sought refuge within the grandeur of these mansions, unaware that they had entered a world where horrors reign supreme. They don't realize it, but they just stepped into the realm of Mr. Scary Guy. Prepare yourself for a journey beyond the ordinary, into the shadows of your deepest fears. Welcome to the world of Mr. Scary Guy. My name is Bill, and I need to tell you about something that happened to me last summer. I've never been the type to believe in ghosts or the supernatural, but after this experience, I don't know what to think anymore. It all started with a letter from my Aunt Margaret. I hadn't seen or heard from her in years. My family wasn't particularly close-knit, and she lived in a small town upstate, far from my life in the city. The letter was an invitation. Uncle Robert, her husband, was gravely ill, and she wanted me to visit. The tone was urgent, almost desperate. She said Uncle Robert had specifically asked for me. I couldn't recall a single meaningful interaction with him, but out of respect and curiosity, I decided to go. The idea of an old mansion tucked away in a remote town had its own strange allure. The drive took almost 6 hours, winding through dense forests and narrow, unmarked roads. By the time I arrived, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows over the property. The mansion was enormous, looming like a dark sentinel. It was the kind of place that looked like it had secrets, with ivy creeping up the walls and windows that seemed to watch you. Aunt Margaret greeted me at the door, her face a mask of worry and fatigue. She was a small, frail woman, her eyes sunken and voice barely a whisper. She led me through the dimly lit corridors, each room more oppressive than the last. We finally reached Uncle Robert's room, a spacious chamber dominated by a large canopy bed. He looked even worse than I had imagined. His skin was pale and clammy, and his breathing was shallow. His eyes, however, were alert and seemed to bore into me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. Aunt Margaret left us alone, and I sat by his bedside, unsure of what to say.
"Bill,"
he rasped, his voice a mere croak.
"I'm glad you came. There's something you need to know."
I leaned in closer, the air around us thick and still.
"Years ago, this house, it wasn't always ours. We took it, Bill. We took it from a family that lived here for generations. There was a misunderstanding, and they were forced out. Their anger, their pain, it never left. It lingers."
He paused, struggling for breath, and I felt a chill run down my spine.
"Their spirits,"
he continued,
"are restless. They seek revenge. And now that I'm dying, they'll come for me. But they won't stop there. They'll come for anyone who tries to claim this house as theirs."
I didn't know what to say. The rational part of me dismissed his words as the ramblings of a dying man, but something in his eyes made me uneasy. Uncle Robert died that night. His passing was quiet, almost as if he had simply slipped away. Aunt Margaret was inconsolable, and I stayed to help her with the arrangements. The funeral was a small affair, attended by a few distant relatives and old friends. After the funeral, Aunt Margaret asked me to stay for a few more days to help with the paperwork and other formalities. I agreed, although the mansion's oppressive atmosphere was starting to get to me. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to explore the house. I had a flashlight with me as I wandered through the dark, dusty corridors. The silence was almost deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. I found myself drawn to a door at the end of a long hallway. It was locked, but I managed to find the key in a nearby drawer. The door opened with a groan, revealing a steep staircase leading down to what appeared to be a basement. The air grew colder as I descended, and an inexplicable sense of dread settled over me. The basement was cluttered with old furniture, broken tools, and various other odds and ends. In the far corner, I saw a large, old trunk. It was covered in dust and cobwebs, as if it hadn't been touched in years. Something compelled me to open it. Inside, I found old photographs, letters, and a diary. The photographs depicted a happy family posing in front of the mansion. The letters spoke of their love for the house, their hopes and dreams. The diary, however, told a different story. It belonged to a woman named Susan, the matriarch of the family. Her entries started off cheerful, but gradually became darker and more frantic. She wrote about how they were being forced out, how they had nowhere else to go, how they felt betrayed. Her final entries were almost incoherent, filled with rage and despair. I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of guilt. My family had taken this house from them, and now their spirits were trapped here, consumed by their anger. As I stood there, lost in thought, I heard a faint whisper. At first I thought it was just my imagination, but the whispering grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to come from all around me, echoing off the walls.
Leave. Leave this place.
I spun around, my flashlight beam dancing wildly. There was no one there, but the whispering continued, growing more urgent. The air seemed to thicken, and I struggled to breathe. I stumbled back up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it, as if that could keep whatever was down there at bay. I tried to rationalize what I had experienced, but the sense of unease lingered. That night, I dreamt of the family in the photographs. They were standing outside the mansion, staring at me with hollow eyes. Susan stepped forward, her face twisted in a mask of grief and rage.
You took everything from us.
She whispered.
Now, we will take everything from you.
I woke up in a cold sweat, the memory of the dream vivid in my mind. I knew I couldn't stay in the mansion any longer. I had to leave, but Aunt Margaret needed me. I decided to convince her to leave with me, to find a new place where we could start fresh. The next day, I broached the subject with her. She was reluctant, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She had felt the presence too, even if she didn't want to admit it. We decided to leave the following morning. I packed my bags and helped Aunt Margaret with hers. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the whispering again. It was louder this time, more aggressive. The air grew cold, and I could see my breath forming in the air. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. I grabbed my flashlight and hurried to Aunt Margaret's room. She was sitting on the bed, her face pale and eyes wide with fear.
They're here,
she whispered.
They won't let us leave.
I tried to reassure her, but the sense of dread was overwhelming. We heard footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate, as if someone was walking towards us. I shined my flashlight towards the door, but there was no one there. The footsteps stopped outside the door, and the whispering grew louder, more urgent.
Leave. Leave this place.
I grabbed Aunt Margaret's hand and pulled her towards the window. We climbed out onto the balcony and made our way down the fire escape. The whispering followed us, growing fainter as we put more distance between us and the mansion. We drove through the night, not stopping until we reached a small motel on the outskirts of town. We were both exhausted, but the sense of relief was palpable. We had escaped, but the memory of what we had experienced stayed with us. Aunt Margaret and I moved to a small apartment in the city, far from the mansion and its dark history. We tried to move on with our lives, but the events of that night haunted us. I did some research and found out that the family who originally owned the mansion had indeed been forced out under suspicious circumstances. They had nowhere else to go and eventually died in poverty. Their anger and despair had left a mark on the mansion, a stain that could never be erased. I still have nightmares about that place, about the whispers and the footsteps in the dark. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget what happened, but I know one thing for sure. Some places are haunted not by ghosts, but by the memories of those who suffered there. And those memories, those lingering emotions, can be far more terrifying than any ghost. When my friend Paul invited me to spend a weekend at his family's mansion on the outskirts of London, I didn't hesitate to accept. Paul and I had been working together for years, and we'd become good friends. He always spoke fondly of the mansion, recounting tales of its grandeur and the surrounding countryside. What he never mentioned, however, were the dark secrets hidden within its walls. The drive to the mansion was pleasant enough. As we left the bustle of London behind, the scenery changed to rolling hills and dense woods. The mansion itself was imposing, a sprawling estate that had clearly seen better days. It stood at the end of a long gravel driveway, surrounded by overgrown gardens and ancient trees. The sight of it sent a shiver down my spine, but I brushed it off as excitement. Paul greeted me warmly and gave me a quick tour of the place. The interior was just as grand as the exterior, filled with antique furniture and family portraits. There was a musty smell in the air, the kind that clings to places long uninhabited. Paul explained that the mansion had been in his family for generations, but had been mostly abandoned after his grandparents passed away. He and his sister had recently decided to renovate it, hoping to restore it to its former glory. After the tour, we settled in the living room with a couple of beers. Paul started sharing stories about the mansion's history, recounting tales of lavish parties and notable guests. As the night wore on, the conversation took a darker turn.
You know,
Paul said, leaning in slightly.
there are rumors about this place. Some people say it's haunted.
I laughed, thinking he was trying to spook me. Haunted? Come on. Paul, you don't believe that, do you? Paul's expression was serious.
I don't know, Henry. There are some things that happened here that can't be easily explained.
He went on to tell me about strange occurrences his family had experienced over the years. Unexplained noises, objects moving on their own, and sightings of ghostly figures. I listened with growing unease, but I still didn't take it seriously. Ghost stories were a dime a dozen, and I wasn't one to scare easily. We decided to call it a night around midnight. Paul showed me to my room, a large, dusty space with a 4-poster bed and heavy drapes. The room felt cold, despite the warmth of the summer evening. I tried to ignore the unsettling feeling that crept over me as I got ready for bed. I must have fallen asleep quickly, because the next thing I knew I was jolted awake by a loud bang. I sat up, disoriented, and listened. The house was silent, but the sound had been real. It wasn't a dream. I checked my phone, 3:15 a.m. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to investigate. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and stepped into the hallway. The mansion was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses in on you. I made my way down the hall, the beam of the flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. As I approached the staircase, I heard another sound, a soft, shuffling noise, like someone dragging their feet. "Paul?" I called out. but there was no response. I descended the stairs, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. It seemed to be coming from the kitchen. The door was ajar, and I could see a faint light flickering inside. I pushed the door open and froze. The room was empty, but the back door was wide open, swaying slightly in the breeze. I knew we had locked it before going to bed. Suddenly, I felt a chill run down my spine, and my instinct screamed at me to leave. I turned and nearly ran back to my room, locking the door behind me. I lay awake for the rest of the night, every creak and groan of the old house setting my nerves on edge. The next morning, Paul found me in the kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee and trying to shake off the unease from the night before. I told him what had happened, expecting him to laugh it off. Instead, he looked concerned.
That's odd,
he said.
I've never heard anything like that before.
We spent the day exploring the grounds, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, I went to bed with a sense of dread, dreading what the darkness would bring. Sure enough, I was awakened again in the early hours. This time, it was the sound of whispering. I lay still, straining to hear. The whispers were faint, indistinct, but they were coming from inside the room. My flashlight was on the nightstand. I reached for it slowly, my heart thudding in my chest. When I turned it on, the beam illuminated a shadowy figure standing at the foot of the bed. I froze, unable to believe what I was seeing. The figure was indistinct, more a shape than a person, but it was there, watching me. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers shaking, and managed to call Paul. "Paul, get in here!" I shouted, my voice trembling. Paul burst into the room moments later, and I pointed at the figure. But when he turned on the light, the room was empty. The figure had vanished.
Henry, what the hell is going on?
Paul demanded, looking around the room. "I don't know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But something is definitely not right here." Paul stayed with me for the rest of the night, but nothing else happened. The next day, we decided to do some research on the mansion's history. We spent hours combing through old documents and family records, hoping to find some explanation for the strange occurrences. What we found was more disturbing than we could have imagined. The mansion had been built in the late 1800s by Paul's great-great-grandfather, a wealthy industrialist named John Altman. John was known for his ruthless business practices and his obsession with the occult. According to the records, he had conducted numerous seances and rituals in the mansion, seeking to contact the spirit world. As we delved deeper, we discovered that John's wife, Eliza, had died under mysterious circumstances. Her death was officially ruled an accident, but there were rumors that John had been involved in some dark rituals that had gone horribly wrong. Some even believed that he had sacrificed her in a bid for power and immortality. We also found reports of servants and guests who'd gone missing over the years, their disappearances never fully explained. The mansion had a dark history, one that had been buried and forgotten over time. That night, armed with our newfound knowledge, we decided to conduct our own investigation. Paul suggested we try to communicate with whatever was haunting the mansion. I was hesitant, but my curiosity got the better of me. We set up a makeshift seance in the living room, lighting candles and using an old Ouija board Paul had found in the attic. As we began, I felt a growing sense of unease. The air seemed to grow colder, and the flickering candlelight cast eerie shadows on the walls.
Is there anyone here with us?
Paul asked, his voice steady. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the planchette began to move, slowly at first, then with more force. It spelled out a single word, Eliza. My breath caught in my throat. Eliza? Is that you? The planchette moved again, spelling out, "Help me." A chill ran down my spine.
How can we help you?
"Find my body," the board spelled out. We exchanged a glance. If Eliza's spirit was truly trapped here, then maybe finding her body could set her free.
Where is your body?
Paul asked. The planchette spelled out a series of numbers. Coordinates, perhaps? Paul jotted them down, and we decided to investigate first thing in the morning. We spent the night in the same room, too afraid to be alone. The next day, we followed the coordinates to a remote part of the estate near an old, abandoned well. As we dug around the area, we unearthed a small, rotted wooden chest. Inside, we found bones. Human bones. My stomach churned as we realized we had found Eliza's remains. We contacted the authorities who took over the investigation. They confirmed that the bones belonged to a woman from the late 1800s. With Eliza's body finally found, we hoped that her spirit would be at peace. That night, we held a small ceremony, laying Eliza's bones to rest properly. As we did, the atmosphere in the mansion seemed to lighten, the oppressive feeling lifting, but our relief was short-lived. That very night, I woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. I sat up, listening intently. The footsteps grew louder, more insistent, and then stopped outside my door. I held my breath, the silence stretching out. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and a figure stood in the doorway. It was Eliza. But instead of a ghostly apparition, she looked solid, almost human. Her eyes were dark, hollow pits, and her face twisted into a sinister grin.
You shouldn't have come here.
She whispered, her voice echoing in the room. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The air around me seemed to thicken, and a sense of dread washed over me. Eliza stepped closer, and I felt an icy chill as her hand brushed my cheek.
Now you belong to me?
She said, her voice low and menacing. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in a hospital bed. Paul was sitting beside me, looking haggard and worried. He explained that he had found me unconscious in the room, my face pale and cold as if I had been outside in a winter storm. He had rushed me to the hospital, fearing the worst. As I recovered, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Had it all been a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by stress and lack of sleep? Or had Eliza's spirit truly taken hold of me? I never returned to the mansion. Paul sold the estate, wanting nothing more to do with its dark past. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear her voice, whispering in the darkness, a reminder that some secrets should never be uncovered. Thanks for joining me for another night of terror. Remember these stories next time someone invites you to visit an old, isolated mansion. Share your reactions in the comments, and if you've got a haunting tale, send it my way. Just remember, the darkness has eyes. This is Mr. Scary Guy saying, until next time, good night.